Marco. Appreciate the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Very much looking forward to getting to know as many of you as I can better. This should be a very fun 2 days. So why did Marco ask me to talk about scaling Agile? If you look at that third bullet there, the maximum number of people I ever directly managed was around 85. So for some people, that's not very large scale at all. For some of you, that might be a big scale. I don't know. I consider it kind of a medium scale. However, if you look at some of the other points on there, which Marco alluded to, there's a lot of other elements that have shaped my perspective, my learning, my experiences on what scale really looks like and what it means and how to deal with it. So context is everything. That is the context. My background there will be what's informing my presentation today. All right, so you can all rest easy. I'm not going to rehash SAFe or discipline agile delivery, anything like that. I'm looking to give you guys, hopefully, things you haven't heard before, some new content. That said, if you are interested in more deeper dive into this sort of thing, these two frameworks are the ones that have been the most helpful for me. And in particular, surprisingly, discipline agile delivery. That I first discovered that about 8 years ago, and it changed the way I thought about scale, and it informs a lot also about what you're going to hear from me today in this presentation. All right, so here's my strategy and goals. These are the goals I have. I don't know how many of you thought spent very much time thinking about what scaling looks like and how it manifests it. So my goal here is to get you to maybe think about scaling a little bit more broadly, more differently. And then when you start thinking about scaling, you're going to realize it's structural, right? And so structural problems, oftentimes the best solution for structural problems are structural solutions. So we're going to talk about the concepts behind structure, and then I'm going to give you some practical guidance on things that have worked for me or not worked for me, right, over the last 30 years. So this is the Chris Karr working definition of scale. And hopefully you've never thought of it this way before, right? I'm provoking a little bit different thinking here. So I'm going to read it out loud. So one time I'm going to read directly off the slide. And then we're going to analyze what this sentence means. I hope you end up agreeing with it. So any structural factor that adds complexity to any part of the software design lifecycle. So look at the bold words. We're going to unpack those a little bit. As I mentioned before, scale is structural. What I mean by that is you cannot make it go away. You can't give a lesson. You can't change your tool. You can't do anything like that. It's always going to be there. It's built in. Complexity. So I don't know how many of you ever looked at scale as complexity, but in my experience, every time scale got added to what I was working on, things got more complicated, harder to do, right? So I want you guys to think about scale as complexity. And then lastly, software design lifecycle, that's pretty obvious, but also remember scale can affect any part of the life cycle from ideation all the way to delivery and sustaining, right? So I talked about complexity, and I use the word mitigating there very deliberately. Mitigating scale, mitigating the complexity that comes with scale is the right strategy. It's the only thing you can do. And so I borrowed this image from a Saturday Night Live skit. I believe the skit's called More Cowbell. It's with Will Ferrell there. And that is my cheap and dirty mnemonic for you all this morning on what to associate when you see Agile scale. Associate cowbell. More cowbell is always the right answer to how to deal with scale. And that's what we're going to talk about. What is cowbell in the context of scale? So these are the ones that come. The first four are the ones we're going to go into in some detail this morning. These are the ones that I have the most experience with and probably have bit me the hardest. And then in particular, the large team sizes, that is the most obvious scaling factor, right? And how it impacts communications and workforce composition and what to do about it. And then on that last slide there, that last line, I'm going to throw in some other scaling factors I have less experience with, but I want to put them all on your radar because maybe you're dealing with them. Right. Large team sizes. The first thing that large team sizes does is puts a strain on your communication. Why? Well, when you're small, people almost always communicate directly with one another. And that's called point-to-point communication. But as your team size grows, guess what? Your number of communication paths between everybody that's on the team actually grows as a function there of n times n minus 1 over 2. So meaning the number of communication paths for everybody to stay coordinated and in sync and in the loop is exponential, grows exponentially. So by the time you get to a scale of even 80, you're at over 3,000 unique communication paths, right? That doesn't scale. That doesn't work. So second communication challenge that happens is when you scale. And I don't know how this work from home thing is going to play out over time, whether that's going to end up being a fad or whether it's a trend. We'll see. But if you do have a large component of your workforce that is work from home, this applies even more so. But basically, human beings require physical space to do their work, right? They need a desk, they need a computer, they need an office, whatever it is. We kind of all know this intuitively, but the farther people are apart, the less likely they are to engage in spontaneous conversation. And spontaneous conversation, a lot of times, is how ideas get generated, problems get solved, etc. And so I actually found this on the web. Some academics at MIT actually quantified this phenomenon, and that's what this chart is. And the key point about this chart is the probability of spontaneous communication drops again exponentially. And by the time you get to somewhere between 140 and 200 feet of physical distance, the probability drops to 0, right? So if you got a remote workforce, probability of spontaneous conversation is near 0, right? Okay, so those are the two main communication challenges you get with larger headcounts. So what is the right solution? For both of these problems, the solution is the same. It is a structural solution. And the idea here is that you need to make your communication system based on a hub and spoke model, where it's asynchronous, and so people don't have to be at the same place, same time. It's self-serve, so you can have a one-to-many communication system. And you notice how I use the word over point-to-point. I like what the Agile framers, how they worded their principles of this over that. It's not that I'm saying you can't or shouldn't ever use point-to-point communication. It's just simply you be aware of the limits of point-to-point. Sometimes it's still necessary. Sometimes you need rapid knowledge transfer or problem solving. You need to get people in a room together and just hash it all out on a whiteboard, whatever it is. But remember, anybody that's not part of that process is completely out of the loop. So if you can, and so what do I mean by the interconnected hub and spoke? At the center of any corporate, now if you're not a CEO, if you're a department head, this is your department wiki, right? And now I've used Confluence in the past. There's plenty of great tools out there, but that one worked extremely well for me. And the idea behind this is anybody in the organization that has the permissions can get to any piece of information in any department by starting with that hub, right? And then follow any of the spokes down. And so this needs to be your organization's primary method of communicating and preserving information if you're going to scale. So second big challenge of large team sizes. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this because this is pretty obvious, but it has bitten me more than once or it wouldn't be on this slide. Personality conflicts. So some people still haven't got the memo that it's not just somebody's technical skills that matter. It's some of their core attributes. And when you scale, probably the most important core attribute is a team first mentality, right? And so you need to be deliberately prioritizing and screening for and background checking and all that sort of thing for people that are proven team players. Now, the interview process isn't perfect. Sometimes people get through. Sometimes a perfectly good person just doesn't mesh with somebody else. So yeah, you can try, reassigning people on teams, all that sort of thing. But the bottom line is, if you make a mistake, you get a toxic person, they have to go. It is poison for a team productivity. Yeah, everything in management ultimately comes down to judgment. So the question, if you didn't hear it, is, what do I mean by toxicity, and what is the threshold? Yeah, there are no, universal objective criteria for anything like, toxicity or even scale. What's medium scale versus large scale? So it ultimately comes down to your judgment. But to me, a toxic person is someone who ultimately either impedes or destroys team productivity for any reason. Oh, intentionality has nothing to do with it. It could just be their personality. Now, when you scale, a lot of times you're going to want to use independent contractors. I've done that many times successfully. You should be aware of some of the risks regarding the typical makeup of individual contractors. The antidote to that is, please check references. I've been burned more times than I can tell you by trying to take shortcuts and not doing that. And then obviously limit your exposure to contractors working on anything that's critical to your sustainable competitive advantage. Okay, so next big challenge after communications, impact on communications, is geographies. So why do we have offshore, nearshore geographies? Well, obviously when we're ramping up people, we're looking to save money. And I've used, as you can tell from my background, Asia teams in Taiwan and India and elsewhere in the pursuit of cost savings. In India, I was probably getting 4-to-1 cost savings, by the way. It's real, but you have to make it work, right? Otherwise, frankly, it'll be a disaster. But when you're in Asia in particular, there's almost no time overlap between your domestic teams and your foreign teams. That creates friction because nobody's going to want to, work late or get up early or whatever on a regular basis. So you have to understand it before you get in, set people's expectations, and then, figure out ways to get around needing to meet all the time face-to-face or, virtually face-to-face. And that usually means more written communication. Your domestic people may not like that because they're not used to having to deal with it. So you need to coach them on why it's going to be so important. Cultural differences. When you go into a foreign jurisdiction, and the farther you get away from North America, the more the culture is different. And that can also kind of come back to bite you. Let me just give you an example here. Taiwan, this is one of my favorite ones. The Han Chinese culture, when you're talking to them, they will oftentimes just nod their heads like this, right? I found out the hard way that doesn't mean they agree with you. It just simply means they understand you. If you want to find out if they agree with you, you have to ask them. You have to ask them nicely because they're going to be afraid to challenge the big boss, right? You have to create a safe environment for constructive criticism. So India, language is superb. I find I use a lot of sports metaphors when I talk. I had no idea how many I was using until I kept hearing clack, clack, clack on the keyboard every time I was talking. And I said, what's going on? They said, well, we're Googling what you just said. And I'm thinking to myself, that's a really terrible way to communicate because this guy's trying to look up, what is a Hail Mary, right? Well, what I said 30 seconds ago, and I'm trying to say something new, and he's still focused on what I said 30 seconds ago, right? So those are the types of pitfalls I'm talking about when you're dealing with offshore teams. And then lastly, English language. This is an important one. They got the job because they claimed that they were fluent in English. But we all know fluent isn't a binary state, it's a continuum, right? And spoken language can be particularly challenging because usually the speed of communication is very high, right? And so someone who's not as proficient in English is going to have problems. So for you, the leader, you may want to try to use a more simple vocabulary. That worked for me very well in Taiwan, didn't need it in India. More things will be needed to be put in writing. That works usually exceptionally well. And by writing, I mean, put the exchange of technical information in a JIRA ticket, right? Something like that. And then headsets required for all meetings because you don't need any, audio challenges interfering with verbal communications. All right, number of knowledge domains. This one can explode on you in a hurry. Developers always like to work with latest and greatest things, but anytime you take on a new platform or a new tool or a new technology, all right, you are taking on complexity. You are taking on scale. And so you have to be very judicious about when you do it, why you do it, and whether or not when you take something new, you can retire something old. And then the last idea there is, if you're working at a small company, you think scale doesn't apply to you. Well, my last job was a fairly small company. We're $100 million a year. I ended up, because some of these other functions that were adjacent to me, upstream or downstream, thank you, I ended up taking on some of those responsibilities, like requirements analysis and project management and that sort of thing. Well, guess what? Those extra functions created more complexity for me. I had to, have new skill sets, new tools, new processes to handle all that. Rapid growth. You may not find that one in a textbook, but I lived that one, and it is a nightmare. At Western Digital, I went from 7 to 50 in 2 years. It broke everything, every tool, every process, every system we had. And I wish I knew then what I know now, and I could have gotten in front of it before all the forest fires, erupted, and we were putting out fires while we were trying to put products out the door, right? Be aware, if you're growing rapidly, that's going to happen. And then the other thing, I don't know how many of you studied team dynamics before, but it takes a while for teams to gel and become high performing. When you're rapidly adding staff, you are disrupting that team and you are setting them back. Your productivity will drop, and you need to plan for that. Okay, and these are my dishonorable mentions. I'm not going to go into any details on these, but maybe you haven't thought of these before and maybe they apply to you. Things like, life criticality, right? I call those solution complexities, large project sizes. This is why we don't like large monolithic applications, right? Modularity, complex domains, things like cryptography or taxes or medical, things that are highly specialized. So those also might apply to you. Scaling is complexity. So the antidote for complexity is simplification. How do we simplify? We simplify by adopting our continuous improvement, our Kaizen, in the areas that are most impacted by scale. And that's your communications and your systems of processes, practices, tools, trainings, all those types of things. That's the only way you can deal with scale. And you have to be eternally vigilant, because as soon as you turn around, right? And the other thing is, you can't manage what you don't see. And so that's why think about scale just in terms of the definition, which I said was any structural factor that adds any complexity to your pipeline, right? You got to see it and recognize it, and then you can take action. So I used Arkus for several years very successfully, and what I found is they didn't have the same drawbacks that an individual contractor had, which was great. So they worked really well for my resource elasticity problem. But I was concerned about not having full-time employees with exposure into the critical IP parts that they were working on. I solved that problem by merging the teams in terms of when they would do code designs and design reviews and actual architectural design work. I would always have them work together on that so that they could keep a line of sight on the IP, the internal employees.
On that slide where you were showing the offshore challenges, can you explain a little bit? Can you compare those? What are with the nearshore challenges as well? Because I'm assuming nearshore you also have, some language barriers, some communication, like Hail Mary and the cowbell, right? So maybe people in Latin America might not understand that. How have you dealt with that?
When it comes to the nearshoring, for the most part, it was a very seamless experience. I was really happy with it. It solves the time zone problem. It solves a lot of the cultural problems. There were, however, some differences. And I'm speaking specifically in terms of U.S. culture versus Mexican culture. The U.S. culture is, rightly or wrongly, we're very much, nothing's impossible, right? Can do, da-da-da-da-da. And it's almost, verboten to even talk about, gosh, maybe this hill is too big to climb, right? So that I did not pick up that same culture from the team in Mexico. And like once or twice it caused a little bit of friction because nobody wants to hear anything negative, about whether or not how practical something is, right? And I'm really nitpicking here. I struggled to find significant problems with nearshore. It really is a nice solution. Now, on the cost effectiveness, I still think you can get a little bit more cost effectiveness in some parts of Asia. Whether that's worth the trade-off to you is another question, and probably has to do with scale, right? In my view, by the time you go, if it's a fairly small effort, nearshore is a perfect option. The larger the effort gets, the larger the team gets, the more the economy of scale is going to weigh in and maybe point the scales toward offshore, especially Asia. Teams that are offshore are kind of used to working shifted hours, right? And so we did a lot of that. So India is the worst possible example, because depending on what time, whether you're daylight savings time or not, they're either 11.5 or 12.5 hours offset for you. So there is nowhere close to office hours. So what I would try to do is get volunteers either on the U.S. side or on the India side, if they had a tight coupling with their counterparts, and get them, one or both of them, to shift their hours. And so I didn't care basically when you clocked in. I couldn't, right? The question was, were you getting the job done, and were you working effectively with your partner? That's the most effective way to do it. And then the second most effective way is put more communication in writing, right? Either in your Confluence or in your Jira or whatever, better in writing because then you have a permanent record of it. But as a practical reality, it's about shifting hours.
So my question is twofold, right? First, in terms of integrating the offshore and nearshore team, do you prefer a more of an augmented staffing model when the teams are offshore teams is integrated with your existing team, or do you prefer more of a project-based model when you co-locate your offshore team together and run your Scrum, your Agile processes alone? The second part of that is, could you give, there's the employee of record, right? EOR model as well versus using a complete offshore agency, right? Is there any preference or, well, I think those are my two questions. Thank you.
So I am a big believer in co-location in general for teams. Where possible, I try not to directly embed people in different locations into the same team. Right? That's really, really hard because communication suffers, and usually it's like one person, one place or the other, and they kind of, they don't feel like they're part of the team. So I'm a huge believer, have discrete teams all physically located together as much as possible. I think your second question relates to when you go offshore, is it better to sort of build your own offshore team versus, go with an agency? I think it has to do with what your objectives are, what your time horizon is, how much elasticity you're looking for. If you think the team is going to be relatively stable and relatively in terms of charter workload, and relatively long duration, like multi-years, I do think it's better to set one up and manage it directly yourself. There is going to be some legal overhead that you're going to have to deal with once you set up operations in that country. But that is the preferred method if it's going to be a long-term commitment and you don't need a huge amount of elasticity in that workforce. Otherwise, the opposite being true, I've had good success working with third-party companies that have a turnkey workforce ready to go. But again, I get really nervous about, if that's going to be a critical part of my IP, it's just a no-go, and you just got to do it the other way. Thank you.